A few years ago, I was getting ready to move from Cleveland, Ohio, south to Columbus. A week before my move, I went out of town with a friend. We stayed for a weekend and drove back the following Monday. The drive was long. We were both hungover, and all I could envision was getting into my own car, inhaling some fries, and sprawling on my couch. Plus, my roommate had already moved out. So when I got home, it was just going to be me and my cat, Harley. I was ready. So sure enough, my friend dropped me off at my car that Monday evening. I drove down the street to McDonald's for some fries and a shake, and then was finally home. When I opened the front door, Harley was right there, waiting like she usually does when she hears my key in the lock. But as I walked in that night, she was crying, making this horrific noise she doesn't usually make. Normally, when I get home, Harley chirps a little, but this was a mewling that sounded painful. I knew something was up. Of course, I asked her, "What's wrong, girl?" and then looked around. That's when I noticed the TV I had in the living room was gone. I immediately ran up the steps to my bedroom, and that TV was gone too. I ran back down the steps and called my roommate, asking if she had decided to borrow the TVs for the weekend, which I knew was super unlikely, but I was also trying to be optimistic. Of course, she said no, and then said she'd come over because obviously someone had broken in. I called another friend who had helped watch Harley while I was gone. He, too, said that there had been TVs there all weekend, but that he hadn't been in the house since Sunday night. I went outside, sweating, realizing that I might not be alone in the house. I was afraid to go near the basement or my roommate's empty room. I called the police. I called my landlord. Everyone converged on the house. It was only when the police were there that I went into the backyard and discovered that our kitchen window had been expertly removed. The window was propped against our recycling bin, which was on its side. The police asked me if I had any idea who would want my TVs, and some other objects we discovered were missing, although the TVs were the most glaring items. I couldn't think of anyone. My landlord kept asking if I had any exes that I had pissed off, which I thought was weird, and I insisted that there wasn't even an ex, much less an angry one. He asked at one point, "Not even a dude you rejected at the bar?" To which I asked how a guy I had rejected would know where I lived. With all of the paperwork filed, the police said that a detective would come by in the morning to fingerprint the window and some other areas of the house. They advised me not to stay in the house that night, given that sometimes repeats happen. They also told my landlord not to touch the window itself, but that he could board the window opening with plywood temporarily. The police said everything in the backyard needed to stay exactly as it was. I asked if my landlord wanted me to stay while he boarded the window. He said no and told me to go stay with my roommate for the night. I slept but was unsettled. The next morning, I met the detective at the house. When we got to the backyard, the whole scene had been rearranged. The recycling bin had been moved across the yard. The window was flipped. Items that had been scattered from our kitchen in the backyard were thrown away. I told the detective, who kind of shrugged it off, and then he took fingerprints from the window as well as some furniture in the house. Everything had either been wiped down or touched by someone wearing gloves. He couldn't get any evidence from anything in the house or what was left in the backyard. After he left, I called the police department again, as I was still concerned that the scene had been rearranged. The police chief ended up on the phone with me. He told me to never be at the house alone. It seemed someone might not be done with me. Since I was moving anyway, this was easy enough. A friend with a pit bull sat with me the rest of the week while I packed. Harley and I stayed with my old roommate every night. I got a tattoo and had a going away party. I left the house behind. While I was driving to Columbus, though, I couldn't stop thinking about the break-in and the fact that someone had come back. It had been so clean, no broken windows, no broken locks, nothing. And then I remembered somehow that just after we moved into the house over a year before, my roommate and I had run into our landlord while we were out. We had said hi and moved on, but then he kept texting me, trying to get us to a different bar. We never met up with him that night and never saw him out again. He's the only person I rejected who also knew where I lived. In my first job out of college, I moved from a big city to rural coastal Louisiana to work for a newspaper. I'm talking an hour and a half south of New Orleans, deep in the swamp, alligators on the roads, old people still speaking French to each other, and the only way between towns was miles and miles of remote two-lane highways winding along bayous. Late one night, I was coming back from an assignment extra tired. I worked hard at my job, slept bad, and the stress was bone deep. I just wanted to get back to the office, finish my writing for the night, and go home. Bayou Sale Road would get me to my destination sooner, though I hated to take it at night. It wound in sharp corners through the open pitch-black marsh. No shoulder, no street lights, just a few skeletal trees and the open grassy water. I slowed down to a crawl to drive it. This was the end of the world, and no one was coming to get you if you made a mistake. But when I took one of the hard, blind corners, I had to slam on my brakes. There was an older man in the road, and he didn't flinch even when my brights caught him in their spotlight. I wondered if he was drunk and worried about what I should do. There were no houses around here, and he might be in some kind of trouble. I sat there with my foot on the brake, waiting for him to say something, some small desperate tale like, "Thank God you came, I've been in an accident," or "My car broke down and I need a ride into town." But he was as still and quiet as I was, and we only stared blankly at each other waiting for the other to make a move. "You could just leave," a small part of me said. "You're a woman, and you're alone. No one would blame you." The only way past him on the narrow road would be to pass him so closely he could have reached out and touched my car door. I cracked my window and asked if he needed some help. He only looked at me. I started to feel a creeping panic, my body responding to the idea that something was wrong. "Fuck this," it screamed. "Not now. Not today. I'll call someone," I told him finally, and rolled my window up firmly, checked the door locks, and took off around him. He didn't waver from his spot in the road, even as I hit the gas and carefully dipped around him, crunching on the narrow gravel shoulder. One quick turn, and he disappeared behind me in the marsh. I was spooked, so I drove fast and didn't stop and waited until I finally saw the first lit-up signs of civilization, a gas station and convenience store, to get out of my car to call the cops in the presence of other people. The clerk listened silently while I reeled off my story on the phone to an officer who promised to drive down there and look for the man after taking my information. When finally hung up, she said, "You were down there on Bayou Sale?" "Yeah," I said. "He was alone? No car?" "Yeah," I said. "I have no idea how he got out there. There was nothing." "He asked you for a ride?" she said. "No," I said. "You offered to give him one?" she said. "Great," I thought. Now she thinks I'm some kind of asshole. "No," I said. "But..." "Good," she said, "because that probably wasn't no man this time of night." The road, she said, was haunted by spirits who would often try to catch tourists. People who didn't know any better, and if you agreed to pick the spirit up, he could ask for another favor, usually your soul, she said. I nodded gravely at the woman, but laughed hysterically to myself when I finally got back into my car, still shaking a bit with adrenaline and fear. What a stupid thing to get taken in by. The hitchhiking ghost was a classic kid's campfire story. I had more to fear from any living man than a dead man. When I still couldn't shake the creeps the next day, I called the cops back to see if they'd ever pick someone up, sure he'd just been some old drunk. They drove the road several times, the cops said. There was no one. I'm a social worker, and I worked for 2 years in a homeless shelter in Ireland. The shelter was big, divided into apartments, and housed mostly women, often with children, who were recovering from substance abuse and getting their lives together. There were a lot of one-on-one case working between staff and residents, so we generally had close relationships. Staff, social workers, night staff, employees handled admin and maintenance, managing the shelter and looking after health and safety. I mentioned this shelter was in Ireland. In fact, it was a former Magdalene home. For those of you in America and beyond who may not know, these are institutions set up and run by the Catholic Church to, for the most part, detain fallen women who'd had children outside of marriage, and put them to work in industrial laundries. This, along with borstels and mother and baby homes, etc., were common in Ireland in the 20th century. Women were basically taken from their homes, locked up in the institution, made to work, and forcibly separated from their children for their sins. These days, revelations about the abuse and cruelty done to women in these places, as well as the fact that their babies were often sold into illegal adoption abroad, is an ongoing topical controversy in Ireland. You may have heard about it. Anyway, this shelter where I worked had been a Magdalene home back in the day. Now it was run progressively and secularly, but still in the same seriously creepy 19th century building. I remember going into the attic shortly after I started and seeing spooky old prams and old-fashioned toys stowed away. In the corridors and staircases, there were life-sized religious statues and Catholic effigies everywhere. The whole place gave me the creeps, but some parts more than others, the older wings with the most evidence of religious mania. The first sign of something else being awry came when night staff started to report, separately and frequently, that the sound of a baby crying was coming from one of the rooms in the shelter late at night. This room was in the basement of the building, and more than one member of night staff. These staff, being contracted and interchangeable so they didn't know each other, recorded that they had heard crying at night, gone down and knocked on the door, and gotten no response. They were angry because they assumed this meant that a woman who was staying in the room was either sneaking out at night and leaving her baby behind, or possibly, unfortunately, using drugs or drunk and not seeing to the baby. This was the reason they recorded it, and the reason this complaint was raised at a staff and board meeting, only for us to confirm that there was nobody staying in that room. This room was empty at night. The second stage of weird came when I went up to casework a new woman who had moved in with her little kid in a different room upstairs. She reported that everything was fine and she was settling in, working with social workers, etc. But she joked that her 4-year-old son kept messing around in the old wardrobe and claiming that he had a friend in there, another little boy called Michael. Yeah, the kid said from where he was playing on the floor, Michael comes out of the wardrobe to play with me at night. This is eerie enough, but more so because we'd heard this before. The family stationed in that room prior to this woman had a little girl who likewise played with her imaginary friend, the boy in the wardrobe. I kind of had to act like I wasn't freaked out by this. By now, we were under instruction not to talk about the creepy aspects of the building in front of the residents, in case they got anxious or wanted to move rooms. In another room, we had kids talk about the woman in the wall. In a room with a low-hanging beam, a resident called us one night, distressed, and explained that even though she knew it sounded crazy, she kept dreaming of a woman hanging from the beam. She woke up and felt sure she could see this woman hanging, that she wasn't alone in the room. She knew it sounded crazy and she was sorry to be trouble, but could she by any chance switch rooms? About this time, one of my coworkers was also a pastor who nonetheless came from a culture with a healthy respect for the supernatural. I asked him, did he think there was something up with the building? He answered simply, "Oh God, yes. It's haunted." He then said, "But they don't mind us. They don't have a problem with us. It's the nuns they don't like." I didn't like the nuns either. There weren't many of them left, but they lived in one wing of the building, most being old and past retirement. They didn't have formal control of the shelter anymore, but often tried to intervene, and so, partly to annoy them, some of my coworkers and I decided to officially request of management that we be allowed to take down all of the religious effigies and symbols from the common areas since, as we pointed out, this was no longer a strictly Catholic space. but non-denominational. The nuns were quite annoyed, as you can imagine, but had to agree. We took it all down and put it in the storeroom. For a joke, I pilfered an old wooden crucifix. I was having a house party that night. It was close to Halloween, and I thought that it would make a good, funny accessory. I brought the crucifix home and put it on the coffee table. During the party, a friend of mine asked what it was about, and when I told her, she seemed kind of upset. "I really don't like it," she said. "It's making me feel weird. I think you should put it back. That place, the former Magdalene home, is bad luck." To appease her, I put it on a shelf out of the way. That night, as I lay in bed alone, I was woken by a sound from downstairs. This was a sound of dragging, like something dragged along the wall, followed by a crash. At the time, I was by myself and immediately thought it might be an intruder. Fired by adrenaline, I got up and put the lights on, calling, "Who's there? Go away." When I came downstairs, I saw that there was nobody there and everything was locked, etc. But in the middle of the floor, there were two framed pictures broken. The pictures had been hanging on the wall by the shelf, the same shelf where I'd put the crucifix, and had apparently managed to fall from the wall on their own with nobody there to touch them. The sound I'd heard had been the sound of these heavy frames, hung by string, being lifted up from their hooks, scraping the wall and smashing on the ground. These, were framed photos of family and friends. Believe it or not, I went upstairs and back to bed. I don't think I could cope with the craziness of the idea that the crucifix might have had something to do with it. I had never felt threatened or unsafe in this house, where I'd lived for years and which I loved, but I'll never forget the dream I had the following night. I dreamt, I'm sure it was a dream, of sitting up, seeing the landing light come on, and also seeing the shadow of a figure standing outside my room, a figure with hooves for feet. Needless to say, I brought that crucifix right back to the storeroom and left it there. I've since moved on, and I no longer work in that shelter, but I still work as a social worker and deal, more often than you'd expect, with the legacy of religious oppression and institutionalization in Ireland. Also, last year, after I'd left that job, a very big news story broke over here. So big you may have seen in the U.S. An old mother and baby home in Tuam, County Galway, was investigated and shown to have a hidden and disused septic tank underneath it. What was in the septic tank? The shrouded remains of almost 700 babies and children who had died of neglect or illness or at birth in the home, and been placed there instead of having proper burials. Naturally, the country was outraged and horrified. It's basically a crime scene, with activists fighting to have further investigations into what went on in these homes over the decades they were active revealed. I think of the crying baby in the basement of my old workplace, to be honest. In the past, it might have been crazy to think there was more to the building than it being creepy and sad. That there might be something underneath the building, but now it doesn't seem quite so crazy. I also think of what my coworker said, though, that the ghosts or the unhappy spirits, or whatever they were, didn't have any problem with the staff and residents. They were there, but they didn't want to frighten or torment us. It was the nuns, the evidence of religious oppression, that held all the bad energy. The fact that I wasn't all that afraid when the crucifix seemed to throw pictures off my wall tells me. Also, that this was a warning rather than anything too bad. I brought the thing back, and it left me alone. But there is something seriously wrong with that old building, where so much unhappiness went on, and I don't think we're done with having the crimes of the church brought to light. Shortly after my son was born, my then husband and I bought a 100-year-old house for our expanding family, which included the three of us and our medium-large dog. As someone who grew up afraid of the dark, after a strange incident with a neighbor boy looking in my windows as a child, I repeatedly had to tell myself that the creaks and thumps and sounds were normal for a house of that age with old growth trees that bumped the roof and scraped the windows at night, and noisy radiant heat and a back gate that wouldn't stay shut and clanked in the wind. I'd hear something, and instead of investigating, I'd hide under the covers like any reasonable adult. When my then husband and I split up, I kept the creaky house and he kept the medium-large dog. When my son was still small, the two of us were watching a movie in the front room around dusk when my phone died. As a Type B personality, the one charger I had was typically strewn somewhere about the house. This time I found it in the kitchen. But as I crossed to the counter to plug it in, I had the overwhelming goosebump why, tingly sinking sense that something was very, very wrong. I turned and I realized that not only was the back gate open again, someone was sitting cross-legged in the yard seemingly staring at the house. They had a hood and dark sunglasses despite the fleeting light and didn't move even when I stepped closer to the window to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. They remained eerily motionless when I was certain they could see me, and still even when I was pretty sure they could see that I had seen them. I quickly locked the back door, grabbed my phone and my charger, and headed into the dining room to my laptop, where I sent the first person I could see online a message that someone was sitting in my yard staring at my house, and that my phone was dead, and to please call the police if they didn't hear from me in a few minutes. I assumed whoever was in the yard would leave once sighted, but nevertheless waited on tenterhooks, impatiently staring at my still useless phone. After an awkward conversation with my son about why we weren't going to the kitchen to get a glass of water, finally lit up and I was able to call 911. I tried to calmly explain to the dispatcher that I was sure the person was gone, but begged that they please send an officer to check my yard as the motionless staring was unsettling at best. Keeping me on the phone, she asked if I could look out a window without being seen to verify, as well as check the locked door. I awkwardly crept as stealthily as I could toward the kitchen, slowly realizing that while the back door was locked, it also had a very clearly too large dog door with no functioning way to block it. Panicking, I stood slightly in an attempt to scan the yard and came face to face with a hood and sunglasses staring down at me through the window. At this point, I was incoherent as the dispatcher urged me to grab my son and hightail it to a locked room. I dart back to him and explain we need to go now, and as I pick him up, I hear the clear and unmistakable sound of the dog door slowly swinging open. I abandoned the house, leaving the front door wide open, and dashed across the street to pound on my neighbor's door. Once inside, they kindly paused their dinner party to distract my son while I stared across the street and messily sobbed about our very indoor cat we left behind. Not long after the officers arrived, they came through the side gate with hood and sunglasses in tow. They'd apprehended her calmly, sitting on my back step, her arm lazily, purposefully swinging in and out of the dog door. I boarded the dog door shut that night, but we moved shortly thereafter, as I was never quite sure after that if all the nighttime knocks and bumps and open gates I'd been hearing were actually just the old house. My cousin was shot and killed in the late 90s. He was very young, only 21, a victim of mistaken identity. He and I got along well, and I loved him, of course, but we weren't particularly close, so when I started dreaming of him constantly, it was unnerving and very draining. Years passed. I got married, had a son, moved a couple of times, but I'd still have very lucid dreams of him. It was exhausting. One afternoon, I fell asleep on the couch in our living room while my son played quietly on the floor. My husband had night school, so he didn't get home until 9 or so it was just our son and I that were home. At some point, I realized my son had stopped playing. We just stared at each other. There was a strange sort of tension in the air. While I napped, I had one of those very lucid dreams. I was napping on the couch, but knew he was approaching our house. I knew, in the dream, that he was dead. The knowledge filled me with a paralyzing feeling of dread. I couldn't move and was very afraid as he walked up our driveway. I could see his shadow walking past the front windows, saw his silhouette through the frosted glass of our front door. In my dream, my son, only a toddler, saw him and stood up and began to approach the door. I couldn't call out to him, warn him away. My son babbled, and my cousin cocked his head at the sound. Somehow, I was able to move, and I enveloped my son in my arms and silently pleaded with my cousin, "I'm so sorry, Stephen, but please, please. I can't, please go. Please just go." I saw his shoulders slump, and he turned away. I felt terrible, but the fear would not let up. I peeked through the window beside the front door and saw him walking away, turning the corner by our garage, and then I startled awake. I looked around outside. Through the window, all was normal. My son was still playing on the floor. Everything was okay. I picked up a book I'd been reading to take my mind off my disturbing dream. At some point, I set it down and realized my son had also stopped playing. We just stared at each other. There was a strange sort of tension in the air, a ringing in my ears. Suddenly, there was a loud crashing sound. Our glass screen door had shattered. Shortly after my son was born, my then husband and I bought a 100-year-old house for our expanding family, which included the three of us and our medium-large dog. As someone who grew up afraid of the dark, after a strange incident with a neighbor boy looking in my windows as a child, I repeatedly had to tell myself that the creaks and thumps and sounds were normal for a house of that age with old growth trees that bumped the roof and scraped the windows at night, and noisy radiant heat and a back gate that wouldn't stay shut and clanked in the wind. I'd hear something, and instead of investigating, I'd hide under the covers like any reasonable adult. When my then husband and I split up, I kept the creaky house and he kept the medium-large dog. When my son was still small, the two of us were watching a movie in the front room around dusk when my phone died. As a Type B personality, the one charger I had was typically strewn somewhere about the house. This time I found it in the kitchen. But as I crossed to the counter to plug it in, I had the overwhelming goosebump why, tingly sinking sense that something was very, very wrong. I turned and I realized that not only was the back gate open again, someone was sitting cross-legged in the yard, seemingly staring at the house. They had a hood and dark sunglasses, despite the fleeting light, and didn't move even when I stepped closer to the window to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. They remained eerily motionless when I was certain they could see me, and still even when I was pretty sure they could see that I had seen them. I quickly locked the back door, grabbed my phone and my charger, and headed into the dining room to my laptop, where I sent the first person I could see online a message that someone was sitting in my yard staring at my house, and that my phone was dead, and to please call the police if they didn't hear from me in a few minutes. I assumed whoever was in the yard would leave once sighted, but nevertheless waited on tenterhooks, impatiently staring at my still useless phone. After an awkward conversation with my son about why we weren't going to the kitchen to get a glass of water, finally lit up and I was able to call 911. I tried to calmly explain to the dispatcher that I was sure the person was gone, but begged that they please send an officer to check my yard as the motionless staring was unsettling at best. Keeping me on the phone, she asked if I could look out a window without being seen to verify, as well as check the locked door. I awkwardly crept as stealthily as I could toward the kitchen, slowly realizing that while the back door was locked, it also had a very clearly too large dog door with no functioning way to block it. Panicking, I stood slightly in an attempt to scan the yard and came face to face with a hood and sunglasses staring down at me through the window. At this point, I was incoherent as the dispatcher urged me to grab my son and hightail it to a locked room. I dart back to him and explain we need to go now, and as I pick him up, I hear the clear and unmistakable sound of the dog door slowly swinging open. I abandoned the house, leaving the front door wide open, and dashed across the street to pound on my neighbor's door. Once inside, they kindly paused their dinner party to distract my son while I stared across the street and messily sobbed about our very indoor cat we left behind. Not long after the officers arrived, they came through the side gate with hood and sunglasses in tow. They'd apprehended her calmly, sitting on my back step, her arm lazily, purposefully swinging in and out of the dog door. I boarded the dog door shut that night, but we moved shortly thereafter, as I was never quite sure after that if all the nighttime knocks and bumps and open gates I've been hearing were actually just the old house. Back in the late 2000s, I was in my early 20s and living happily for a few years as a broke expat in Berlin. One of my roommates, who was from the UK, and I were out late-ish seeing a band play, maybe around midnight or 1 a.m., and afterwards we were headed home, walking through a relatively central but quiet part of the city toward a subway station entrance. We were in high spirits after a couple drinks and a fun night out. Not too drunk, just a little tipsy, and we were laughing and chatting, probably somewhat loudly, as we headed arm in arm towards the subway entrance, which was ahead of us down at the far end of a long, quiet street. It was late October/early November, and still warm enough for it to feel nice to walk outside, and the misty air hung in yellow halos under the streetlights. Just as a little gust of wind blew some leaves across the pavement in front of us, we both became aware of a figure walking ahead of us in the mist. From the back, it appeared to be an older woman, stooped over, carrying bags in each hand, and walking with a very pronounced limp, sort of dragging one of her legs along behind her. We were speaking English and nearly about to pass around her on the sidewalk, when the woman cried out rather exaggeratedly in English, but with a thick German accent, "Oh, help! Won't somebody help me?" She didn't sound frightened or worried so much as deeply demanding, and her tone of voice suggested she expected to be helped. My roommate tried to keep us moving ahead past her, but I softened and slowed down my pace because, after all, this was an elderly woman carrying bags late at night, and she clearly couldn't walk very well. I asked her what she needed help with, and she said, "It's my leg. Help me carry the bags. I live just over there," and she nodded toward an apartment building entryway a half a block up the street. My inner Good Samaritan instincts kicked in, and I responded automatically, "Oh, of course we'll help you." My roommate seemed decidedly less enthused for some reason, but begrudgingly followed me as we each grabbed one of the woman's bags and carted them to the doorstep up the street. As the woman's face came into sharper relief underneath a nearby streetlight, I realized that she looked exactly like a witch out of a German fairy tale. Bent posture, a large wart on her nose, grayish-white, straggly hair, and she was wearing dark wool clothing with a hood. I was honestly taken aback by her appearance and nearly gasped out loud. But again, wanting to be polite, I pushed this to the back of my mind. Who cares what she looks like? I told myself, she's just an elderly lady who needs our help. When we arrived at her building's doorstep, the entryway door was surprisingly ajar, not the norm at all in the neighborhood we were in, and she pushed it open easily, suddenly seeming to possess more strength than she had had moments before, and leaned forward to hold it for open me so that I could go in first, and she would be behind me. She gestured up a dark and dingy flight of stairs and breathed, "Just up the stairs, just up the stairs." I froze in my tracks for a second in the doorway as my tipsy 23-year-old brain tried to puzzle it out. Logically, the polite thing to do would be to carry the bag up the stairs for this woman, right? But then again, all the hairs were standing up on the back of my neck, and the building's hallway and narrow staircase, in the dim fluorescent yellow light, looked awfully foreboding. I could just make out a doorway at the top of the stairs on the right-hand side that was also slightly ajar, leading into an apartment. An air of intensely stale, musty smoke wafted down the stairs. And then there was the tone of stark urgency in the woman's voice as she urged me to step fully inside and get up the stairs as quickly as possible. If I had to describe her tone, it wasn't too far from the voice of a cartoon villain rubbing their hands together while hatching a nefarious plan. As I stood in the entryway, tipsily trying to weigh the very bad feeling in the pit of my stomach against my lifelong fear of being impolite, I actually giggled at how absurdly horror movie-esque the moment felt. So much so that it couldn't be a real threat, right? It was too spot on, so I must be imagining it. Fortunately, my roommate, who had seen more shit in her life than I had at that point, literally yelled out, "Oh hell no," hooked her arm into mine, and pulled me out the door and down the street as quickly as possible. The old woman yelled disappointedly after us as my roommate whisked me across the street and down the subway stairs, back into the safety of a warm, brightly lit public space full of people. Once we had safely escaped, my roommate shared the two things that had set off definitive alarm bells in her head. One, she was certain that the woman's limp wasn't there initially as she walked ahead of us, and that it had only appeared as we got closer to her. And two, in her words, "As you stood in the doorway, I suddenly knew that she had a creepy adult son waiting for us at the top of the stairs who was going to chain you to her bed." Perhaps it was just our fanciful imaginations, but I have always felt grateful to my roommate's instincts for keeping us away from whatever was at the top of those stairs. My rural neighborhood is home to a large feral cat population, and I always keep food and water out for them on my deck. Last spring, I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. I sat down to pee and looked out the window, which has a clear view down over the deck. Looking down at the deck, I saw a large figure at one of the bowls. I was half asleep, and it was quite dark, though there was some ambient light from our garage, and at first I thought it was a raccoon, or a giant skunk, or maybe even a coyote. Then, with the most skin-crawling sense of horror, I realized it was a human man crouched on all fours, eating cat food out of the bowl with his mouth. I whisper-yelled to my husband with, I guess, enough panic in my voice that he immediately got up and came into the bathroom without asking why I was whisper-yelling for him at 2 a.m. and kind of spluttered and pointed out the window. He looked out, and I could see the same reaction play out over his face in the few seconds it took him to realize what was going on. It's a large cat. No raccoon. No coyote. No WTF, it's a human. I called 911 and told the dispatcher there was a strange man on our porch acting suspiciously. "Ma'am," he said, "what do you mean suspiciously?" I told him there was a guy eating cat food out of a bowl with his mouth. No hands, on the back deck. He said he'd send a patrol car right over. Meanwhile, my husband tiptoed downstairs to get a baseball bat from a closet, and I continued peeking out the window to keep an eye on the dude, barely believing what I was seeing. At some point, I suppose he must have stopped eating. There wasn't that much food out to begin with, and unless he was eating kibble by kibble, he would have finished very quickly. But he remained in the same hunched, crouched position over the bowl, the back of his head and his face obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. Then, with the most skin-crawling sense of horror, I realized it was a human man crouched on all fours, eating cat food out of the bowl with his mouth. After what felt like hours, but was actually more like 5 or 6 minutes, we saw headlights approaching from down the road. Our visitor must have seen them too, because he got up, easy as you please, walked off our deck, and disappeared into the shadows at the edge of the yard. We had a cruiser parked in our driveway for the rest of the night, and the next morning installed motion-activated lights and a camera. We took the cat food off the deck at night for the rest of the month. We haven't had an unwelcome visitor again, but I will always be afraid of looking out the window in the dark and seeing a man instead of a cat. Many years ago, our son went through an extreme night terror phase that gradually morphed to include sleepwalking. He was only 3 at the time and not very articulate yet. He didn't seem to remember the night terrors and wasn't afraid of being alone in his room or even of going to bed on his own. Thither he would go without any prompting, and we'd go check on him and see his little sneakers neatly placed beside his bed and him curled up under the covers in his PJs. We found that having him sleep in bed with us prevented these episodes altogether. So for weeks, we did just that. It was a bit of squash, but definitely beat the alternative. But shortly after we resorted to this fix was when the sleepwalking began. One night, I felt him clamber over me, and groggily I assumed he had to go to the bathroom and almost instantly fell back to sleep. I woke to his terrified screams, disoriented about where he was. My husband found him, shaking uncontrollably, next to his bed, eyes dilated and blank with horror. We carried him back to our bed, holding him close, and waited for him to fall back asleep. This continued to happen off and on for weeks before my mom brought a lady who was a self-proclaimed Karandra, or witch doctor, to our home and had her cleanse it. She said our house had a lot of negative energy from previous tenants and restless spirits of small children who had become attached to our son. This was all horrifying to hear. We had experienced odd things, but none more disconcerting than our son's night terrors. The night terrors stopped after a cleansing, but other activity kicked up, and we continued to have our son sleep in our room, terrified that he'd have another episode. Some of the other experiences were knocks within the walls, doors opening on their own, pictures flying off the wall, doors slamming shut as you approached them, though no one was on the other side to have been able to slam them. We once experienced seeing the shadow of a person, a man, walking around the house, but when we peeked outside there was no one there. The last straw was when the both of us had the same nightmare, woke drenched in sweat, and seeking comfort from the horrifying dream, only to tell it and realize we'd been dreaming nearly the same thing. In the dream, we were across the street, talking to our neighbors when they pointed out that our house was on fire. We looked back and saw that the house was enveloped in black smoke. We could see our son banging his fists helplessly against the front bay window. Panicked, we rushed across the street and into the house searching for him. In my dream, I found him and held him tightly to me as I ran back outside to safety, only to realize the bundle I held in my arms was his baby blanket and not him. I stared back at the house in time to see it collapse in a fury of flames and woke up screaming. My husband dreamt he went into the house and could hear my son crying out for him and couldn't find him. Then he heard a soft daddy and reached down and grabbed him up and ran outside. As he ran, he realized that our son felt very light in his arms, and when he looked down, he saw he was only holding a teddy bear. Needless to say, this rattled us even more. We promptly moved out, staying in my parents' small guest room until we could sell the house. It wasn't on the market long, and wanting to be upfront about our experiences, we told the buyer against our realtor's advice. He was a much older man who planned to use it as a rental property and waved off our experiences as nervous nonsense.